Well, I'm excited today to talk to Harold McGee, who I'm dialing in with. Harold, you're in San Francisco?
That's right, Mike. Yes.
And there's a lot of reasons why I'm excited to talk to you. I've been a fan of your work for some time. So much of what you've done has set the foundation for things I write about in a lot of ways with your book you wrote, I think, in 1984.
That's right, yes.
On food and cooking, which really kind of kicked off this molecular gastronomy revolution in many ways. You're kind of the OG author there.
Well, I'm a little reluctant to take credit for.
I'll give you credit. You don't have to take credit. I'll give it to you. That's fine.
Okay.
But the real reason we'll talk about that. I want to get your thoughts on some of the things that's going on in that space. But the real reason we're talking today is because you actually have a new book, which I have right next to me here, called Nosedive: A Field Guide to the World Smells. It's a big book. Looks like 600 pages. I haven't read it all. I've read some of it, but I'm excited to talk to you about this. You, in the intro of the book, you talked about how you went on a 10-year journey. You became like a smell explorer. Why did you decide to write a book on smells like this?
Well, great question, and I sure didn't see it coming. I started out thinking that I would write a book about flavor. Okay. Because, my beat is food, and I just felt, having done it for a decade or two, that really the most interesting thing about food, for me anyway, was flavor, the kind of immediate pleasures that we get from eating. And so I was going to write about taste and smell and how it is that foods satisfy us through those senses. But I got sidetracked by a couple of experiences that just made it clear to me how strong an impact flavor can have on one. And then also beginning to recognize, as I paid more attention to smell in flavors, that foods often echo other things in the world, sometimes other foods, and then things that have nothing to do with food. I mean, wine experts talk about sweaty saddle aromas and stone aromas and soil aromas. And so I began to wonder, why do foods remind us of things like that? And then that led me to ask the question, why do those things have the smells they do? And maybe they had them before foods did, maybe the other way around. And so I just kind of sucked into figuring out as much as I could about the molecules that escape the things of the world and fly into our noses and give information about what they are and what their histories are.
Yeah, and you describe smells in the book as this bridge between the experience of our food and the larger world. And it made me think, that's a great way to put it. It makes me think, is smell the sense that basically allows us to taste the world as we're moving about in it, where we're not eating dirt, we're not eating grass, but in a sense we're getting some of those molecules that are coming from those things into our being and taking them in, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I like to remind people that vision and hearing, which are the senses that we usually pay the most attention to, are very indirect. We're seeing light waves reflected off of things or being emitted by things, and we're hearing sound waves, detecting sound waves, motions in the air from things, but not the things themselves. And that's the amazing thing about smell, is that it gives us detailed information about what it is that thing is. And smell is this bridge between the outer world and our inner experience of food, because we inhale and we exhale. And so we take in things from the outside world as we breathe in. When we're eating, it's as we exhale through our mouth that we get a sense of what it is that we have in our mouths. So it is this wonderful bridge between two very different experiences of the world.
And you mentioned it earlier with wine. You talked about this idea of smell echoes, right? Why there may be cucumbers may taste like oysters, or hints of cucumbers and oysters. And you talked about maybe wood hints within wine. And so you started to ask this question, are these sharing similar molecules? Where did it start to, is this molecule to start here before it got here? What did you discover? Are they sharing the same molecules?
Yes. In fact, that's exactly why they echo each other, is that they're both emitting exactly the same little particles, basic fundamental particles of the world. And we're noticing that. And even though it maybe doesn't make total sense that a wine would smell like a saddle, our brains are picking up on that fact and registering it. And so that's why I try to make the case simply that, we don't need all of us to be sniffing around the way a wine expert does. But the more attention we pay to those little things, to those kinds of, initially they may just be incongruities. You notice a hint of something, a sip of green tea, and all of a sudden you get this, you're reminded of the ocean, seaweed and things like that. Right. Where's that coming from? And so paying attention to that kind of thing, even if you don't track it down, just makes the experience of that tea richer because you're getting more out of it.
One of the things I was thinking about as I was reading a little bit is I thought about when those stories, you've probably seen it where like there's a picture on the internet and one person sees a blue dress and one person sees a white dress. And I started to think, it smell like that. Is it like, how do I know I'm smelling the same thing that Harold McGee is smelling? Or is my brain processing it in a completely different way?
Yeah. And that's a great question that I chose to sidestep completely.
Okay.
With the exception of an introductory chapter where I explain that I'm sidestepping it completely. The thing is that, we just can't know. We all have different sets of olfactory receptors, which are what detect the molecules that are coming from the world. So some of us are smell blind to some things and not to others. And there's no telling whether you have pretty much the same set as someone else. And then even past the receptor, once the signal gets into your brain, we all have different sets of experiences, and experience plays a huge role in determining whether we recognize an aroma, if we recognize it, what kind of description we give it to, what it reminds us of. So smell is very much a subjective experience. And so that's why I actually chose to focus on the objective. So regardless of whether you have the equipment or you're paying attention or, whatever else might be going on, this is what's out there to be experienced. And sometimes if you go hunting for things, you can pick up on them, pick up on things that you wouldn't have noticed had you not been told it's out there.
Now, you mentioned there were a couple experiences that you had that made you think this is an interesting thing, or even like you mentioned how you got sidetracked, like you were going down one path towards flavor and a couple experiences that drove you into smells. Can you describe, were there certain instances in time where you kind of really had an aha moment, said, I'm going to write this book, I'm going to pursue this path?
Well, the one that had the greatest impact on me was actually an experience in a restaurant having food. And it was in England in about 2005 when I had gone to Europe to learn about molecular gastronomy and, what the avant-garde chefs of the day were coming up with. And what they were essentially all trying to do is come up with new experiences for you so that you would just remember that meal vividly because you'd never had anything like this thing before. So all about invention and creation and creativity and innovation, originality, all that kind of thing. Then at the very end of that trip, I went for a very traditional British lunch at a restaurant in London, and I'd never had grouse before, the game bird. And it happened to be grouse season, which is a very short period. And so I ordered grouse at this traditional English restaurant. And the first bite was just so unlike what I was expecting that it knocked me for a loop. I actually couldn't speak for like 30 seconds. My people I was eating with looked at me and thought maybe I was having a stroke or something. It was just the most powerful flavor experience I'd ever had in my life. And I took that to heart. I thought I had no idea that I could be affected like this. Let me look into why that is. I talked with a neuroscientist a little while later, and he said, I think I kind of know what was going on in your brain. Your attention was being diverted from conversation to this sensory experience because it was so unlike what you were expecting, and you had to deal with that first, and then you could get back to the conversation. And then I realized that the experience was as strong as it was because of the grouse, right? And remembering, of course, that this was on a trip to experience innovation and creativity and novelty. And here, the most powerful experience I had was something very, very basic. And people have been eating grouse this way for hundreds of years. And I realized that learning something about the grouse would tell me something about why I responded as strongly as I did. So I went to the trouble of going to grouse country and learning about the bird and its life and how it's handled. And it all began to make sense. Basically, it was a kind of experience of animal foods, foods from animals that we generally don't have in the modern world because we're so removed from how these things are produced. And so grouse is a very powerful flyer. It has red meat throughout rather than white meat because it uses those muscles so frequently and constantly. The bird is wild, and so it gets parasites, and the bird is also, after it's shot, and they're all shot, they're matured for several days with the guts still in the bird. So if there are parasites, then there's some leakage, and you end up with some of the flavors of the guts in the rest of the flesh.
Wow.
And then the bird is cooked, very rare. So a lot of that flavor is all still right there and right in front of you. So learning all that made me realize there's probably a lot like that to learn about many things that we encounter in everyday life, not just foods. And that's the beginning of the push that ended up putting me into the world of smells.
So when you think about the experience of eating food, there's so many components to it, right? There's obviously flavor, as you talked about. There's mouthfeel. There is smell. Do you feel like, obviously, someone has some tasters and people are professional at wine tasting, for example, have very tuned abilities to really sense all these things, possibly. But the creators of the foods, is smell an underappreciated component of what the ultimate experience is? Or is this something that the great chefs do realize and try to bring out when they're making their creations?
The chefs certainly know it, yes. Okay. Because these guys, even if they're not chemists, they belong to a tradition and a profession that goes way back and has made practical discoveries like what is delicious and what's not over those centuries, and come up with techniques for enhancing flavor, for bringing flavor out, for combining flavors that scientists are still working to unpack and understand why they work as well as they do.
So breaking down smell versus flavor, it seems like they're basically almost the same. They're like overlapping circles, but they're not fully overlapping, right? So have you thought about that? How much of the flavor experience is smell versus other components?
Yeah, it's confusing in English because we use these words like taste, the taste of something, and it means the overall flavor experience. Yep. But we also use taste to mean very specifically the sensations that we get on the tongue, which are very small in number by comparison to the different aromas that we can enjoy. So flavor is a combination of taste on the tongue, which is sweet, sour, salt, bitter, savory, and maybe a couple of others. And then aroma, which can be hundreds and hundreds of different things. So if you can chew on something with your nose pinched or with a cold, or unfortunately with COVID, and not be able to tell the difference between a raw potato and an apple, for example. They have similar textures, but they're totally different foods.
You talked about the modern world bringing us and taking us further away from the true flavors and the smells that are out there. And I totally can see that as we move into the more modern society with processed food. We try to scale and mass produce food. There's lots of artificial flavors and lots of artificial smells that basically try to recreate, but that are more just chemicals. So is there value in these artificial things, or do you think we would do well to try and get back to the more original smells and flavors of the world? Does it make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And I would add to what you said about the sort of artificiality of foods these days. I would also point out the artificiality of our lives, our day-to-day lives in general, and especially these days when we're basically sitting at home.
Doing Zoom calls like we are.
Yes. So, we're getting the phenol and formaldehyde from the laptop keyboard. That's a smell that I get around to in the book. But we're missing out on the smell of the open air, the seashore, the forest, all the things that human beings grew up and evolved sensing. And so our everyday sensory lives are much impoverished compared to what they could be. But then when it comes to artificial flavors, I have mixed feelings, because on the one hand, it's just something to appreciate and to wonder at, that, say, a vanilla plant in the jungles of Mexico generates that incredible aroma that we now take for granted. So we talk about plain vanilla, when in fact vanilla is an amazing aroma and complex one. At the same time that scientists figured out that the main component of that aroma is one particular molecule, which is very easily synthesized from all kinds of raw materials. And so they can now make it by the ton. And now it's very, very cheap, plain vanilla. It seems to me that those are two really remarkable things worth appreciating on their own, because I think it's amazing that human beings figured out what it is that makes vanilla, and then figured out that you can duplicate that aroma, or imitate it anyway, with a completely different set of ingredients. And artificial vanilla is affordable, and real vanilla is expensive. So I think it's a matter of knowing how these things come to be and appreciating them for their qualities. And in fact, sometimes choosing the artificial over the natural in order to take pressure off the production of natural vanilla, which is very, very scant and getting scanter. But then at the same time, perhaps inspiring young people to find a cure for the diseases of vanilla that make it so difficult to grow. So I think it's just it's all worth knowing and savoring, each in its own way.
So I want to go back to your first book and talk a little bit about what you kind of were surprised by when you wrote that book, and what it ultimately kind of the wave of interest in that space in molecular gastronomy. Did you expect all that? I mean, you wrote it's a 700-800 page book. It's an ambitious book. I don't know if you ever intended to write that big a book, but once you did, what were you expecting when it landed in the world? And did you expect it to have such an impact? Did you expect it to be such a seminal book?
No, I didn't. So I wrote it basically because I couldn't get a job doing what I wanted to do, which was to teach literature. And for a variety of reasons, I came across the fact that this is an interesting subject, the chemistry of cooking. Mm-hmm. And I had enough friends who were interested in food and cooking that I thought, I'm going to write something down for them and for me and for people like us who are interested in a kind of amateur way in understanding what's going on. And also just for me, really cool things to, open a journal specializing in grains and find scanning electron micrographs of the inside of a wheat kernel before and after it's been puffed. That was just an insight into a world that I didn't know existed. So I wrote the book for home cooks, for interested home cooks. And I did not expect that it would be of that great use to professionals, because I figured at the time they already know how to cook. They're making delicious food. They have been for hundreds of thousands of years. So this might be of interest to them in a kind of offhand way, but certainly not centrally. And that's, in fact, the reception I got from the chefs of the day, the early 1980s, most of whom were not American. They were all from Europe, and they'd come here to open restaurants. What happened then was that the people who were going to culinary schools began to write to me because they found my book and they were finding information and alternatives that their teachers in culinary school or their mentors, their head chefs at the restaurants they were working in wouldn't bother to give them. And so it was the curiosity of that new generation, up-and-coming generation of American cooks that really gave the book some life. And yeah.
So you kind of created a shortcut. Instead of spending 20 years and becoming a chef and learning all these things over 20 years of learning, you put it into a book. So you did an incredible favor to people who were just starting out, maybe.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of young people were really impatient. And you have to remember that food wasn't much of a thing in the 70s or 80s. There were no specialty coffee places at all. People did not use olive oil. And when they did find olive oil in Italian groceries, it was usually a couple of years old and not very good. So there just wasn't the interest and the awareness in food that developed, and that's one thing I feel very lucky about, is that I kind of caught that wave of interest, and then it was the young culinary students who were impatient. They loved it. They wanted to get right in and start doing it for themselves, and they didn't want to peel potatoes for a couple of years before advancing to the meat station.
So let's fast forward to today. You wrote this book. You've written a successor book. There's been things like, the modernist cuisine movement, and they've come out with modernist bread. And there's this whole school of people who are just interested in this space. Looking at today's landscape and, molecular gastronomy, do you feel like there's a lot more work to be done? Are you excited about, are there things you're excited about that people are doing in this space that you help really create an interest in?
That's a really good question. I actually, for a long time, I kind of ignored what was going on in industry because my focus was really on home and restaurant cooking. Mm-hmm. I've actually found myself really intrigued by what's happening in industry recently. And
when you say industry, explain that. What do you mean by that?
Okay. The parts of the food industry that are coming up with meat alternatives, for example, Yep. Dairy alternatives, that kind of thing. Because what's happening is that we're, thanks to science, looking at the world, at all aspects of the world in very different ways than we were 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And the possibility these days of instead of making meat or dairy or other protein alternatives by taking the ingredients that nature gives us and just kind of combining them differently, we're now taking the proteins that make the ingredients at their most fundamental level and coming up with ideas for not only trying to imitate the qualities of a meat or a milk or something like that, but asking, what other possibilities are there? Nature has shown us that these materials can be useful in these ways, but what if we think out of the box and try other things? So I think the creative phase of cooking has to some extent played itself out. I think there are limits to what you can come up with that hasn't been tried before, and usually what's tried and true ends up being still the most delicious things because they had so long to evolve. So what we're really doing now is discovering other parts of the world, other traditions, and appreciating those. Not so much coming up with new permutations and combinations of the ingredients that we've used all the time.
So it sounds like what you're saying is you're interested in some of the work that's being done in some of these inventors, companies, even startups that are finding new ways to create entirely new foods using really interesting bioengineering, or for example. So are you looking like companies like Impossible, right? And they found this property with heme that made a similar, you can make plant-based food and make it taste like hamburger. Is that something like you think is fascinating and is interesting, the type of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. And I should mention that Pat Brown, the founder of Impossible, was a professor of biology at Stanford, and his kids and my kids played on the same soccer teams.
Oh, wow.
Way back in the day. So I've known him for decades. And when he first had this idea of trying to do something about climate change by taking his expertise in cancer biology and applying it to something very, very different, we got together to talk about how that might work.
So did he come to you and say, Harold, I have an idea?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, fascinating.
And the cool thing about what Pat in particular has done, but I think this will probably end up happening many times in the near future, is that he discovered something about what makes delicious. Pat discovered something about what makes meat delicious that the meat industry had never realized. And they have a big research budget. They fund meat scientists all over the place. They considered heme to be the source of off flavors, not the source of flavor, because they'd never taken the kind of bottom-up basic scientist approach to understanding their material.
In a way, what you talk about you found out there's commonalities in molecules, these fundamental building blocks between things that are completely different, a saddle and wine, mushrooms and cucumbers. In a way, that's kind of what he did, right? And found out there's a flavor property that you can derive from plant that ultimately can give the sensation of eating meat, right? So it's like he found this. I think it's a similar concept, right?
In fact, it's the great thing about applying science to pretty much anything, but food in particular. So Pat not only was able to discover by asking very basic, maybe meat scientists would consider them stupid questions at the very beginning, he discovered not only that heme was really important to generating the flavor of cooked meats, but then being a basic scientist, he also realized that heme is in every living thing on the planet. And he could look very, very broadly for that in particular ingredient. And it didn't have to be, not only did it not have to be animals, it didn't have to be plants. And there are possibilities that I find really fascinating. For example, there are bacteria that live in thermal pools in Yosemite Park or in Yellowstone Park that survive at the boiling point, essentially. And so their hemes have to be stable at cooking temperatures and higher, which means that you can use those hemes to make the flavor of the meat come out the way we would like it to. But they will also stay red at the boiling point. You can cook something, a meat-like material that is totally safe, no worries whatsoever about any contamination because it's been heated to such a high temperature, but still have that beautiful color in addition to the flavor.
That's fascinating. I know that Nature's Fine, a company that actually found some original proteins and properties out of that Yosemite Park. So there is some interesting stuff going on there.
Yeah.
Well, anything else that you're excited about when you look on the landscape of innovation around food that you think is, or even smells and just kind of this world that you explore that you're really excited about?
Well, I guess I would just make the very general point. I dedicate the book to the chemists who have investigated these things and made it possible for us to explore, to follow in their footsteps and explore all these different things. It's just astonishing to me that there are so many people with chemical expertise, with the curiosity to go out into the world and, for example, travel to the Amazon and trap the aroma of a particular wild orchid in a bubble and then take it back to Switzerland to analyze exactly what molecules were in there. The human dedication to understanding and appreciating and going beyond the surface is just inspiring. And one of the things I hope to do with this book is just to encourage people to sniff a little harder, and notice a little bit more about what's going on, because it is an amazing world.
Well, I'm sure that you will inspire others to go out into the world and capture things and find new things about the world like you did through your other books. And Harold, I appreciate so much that you spent some time with me to talk a little bit about this book, and I would recommend it. Again, the name of the book is Nosedive, A Field Guide to the World's Smells, and is it available? Can I go buy it now on Amazon? When's it going to be available?
It'll be available on the 20th of October.
So right around the corner. I would encourage everyone to buy this right in time for the holidays. It's something you can you can put this in a stocking or just wrap it. So, but thank you, Harold, for spending time with me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike.
Have a good one.
You too.